The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Robert Lee is the CEO and co-founder of Rescuing Leftover Cuisine. With a bachelor's degree at the Stern School of Business at New York University and a career in finance at various Wall Street firms, Robert Lee left finance to grow Rescuing Leftover Cuisine. When Robert first started in the food rescue space in 2009, the common misconception was that donating food was illegal. RLC has been providing food rescue services since 2013 and is headquartered in New York City. In addition, Mr. Lee has been honored as an Obama Leader USA, Gates Millennium Scholar, CNN Hero, Forbes 30 Under 30 for Social Entrepreneurship, NYC Food Policy 40 Under 40, and Youth Action Net Fellow. Now let's get into the episode with Robert. Welcome back, Dave, John, and Robert Lee, co-founder and CEO at Rescuing Leftover Cuisine.
Great to be back. Really looking forward to this.
Yeah, and me as well. And Robert, thank you again for joining us for our second podcast.
Of course, great to be back.
So I'll kick this off, Robert. And for our listeners, what is deemed as leftover food? How would you define that from your group per se?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very large kind of category. I think there's a lot of food that's considered leftover, right? Everything from the farm level where there's kind of product or produce that is left on the field just because it may not be a certain size or shape. And then it gets even stricter when it goes to the wholesaler. Sometimes, obviously things are, graded, and then even there, things are rejected and considered leftover. And then on the supermarket level, it also becomes leftover when consumers don't like the way they look, or it sits there for a long time. Maybe there's a inventory mishap and, folks may have overordered or got the wrong order, and then things just sit there. And then in restaurants and at homes, things are left over after we have it on our plate and we're too full, or we overmade, or we are just not into the food that day, that kind of thing. So there's tons of levels and kind of categories of leftover food. And, every single step of the process has its own unique challenges.
It's really interesting because twofold. One, as a kid, I grew up in the Canadian Niagara Peninsula, so it's food in, a lot of people aren't aware of what you described. Is there some fruit that may not be the size or the quality of what's needed, so it tends to be left behind or used for other things, like for juice or whatever, but sometimes it's wasted. So I never thought about that as leftover food. And the second thing is we're actively involved in the greenhouse sector throughout North America. Certainly southwestern Ontario is one of the largest greenhouse sectors in North America. So I'm kind of interested how actually they're involved in that. I don't know if you can answer that, but that's a question that I'm going to ask them as we go out on that. So thank you for that. One additional question here. Why do we have so much leftover food? Like, what's the reason for that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there are different reasons for different countries. In the US and in developed nations, the amount of wasted food is kind of reverse supply chain, right? I mean, it's us first. It's us consumers that are wasting the most in our homes, and then at our restaurants, and then at our supermarkets, and then it goes up the supply chain in that order. And I'd say the biggest reason is that we just don't know. We just don't think about it. We consider food as a convenient thing that we just want to get done, or just want to have brought to our door with various delivery companies, and not think about all the natural resources and the work that went into making the food, and then also all the environmental impacts that come after it goes to landfills. I think that's the kind of primary reason, I think, in developed countries. And it's unfortunately kind of the opposite in developing countries. Unfortunately, countries like India, for example, there's a massive amount of kind of percentage of bananas that are wasted just because there's no proper cold chain. Obviously, bananas are a bit fickle and they're, harder to kind of keep in a, kind of unripe state to get to the consumers in a good quality. But the consumers there cherish the food, and the amount of food waste on the consumer level is minimal. And it's remarkable to kind of think that we can solve both problems by kind of, changing the mindset here and bringing the cold chain we have, to, everywhere, really.
Just a quick follow-up. Like you said, the last podcast that you're in 9 cities. Do you have, by chance, can you benchmark, is there greater food waste in different cities, or is it pretty well the same? Like, I don't know if that's data that you track.
Yeah, right now the data that we have tracks to kind of history. It's basically whichever city we've kind of landed on first and had the most resources to expand in.
Right.
But I wouldn't be surprised if, after we've really dug deep, we see different types and also different amounts of excess food in different cities.
Okay, this next question's a cheeky one because I want you to put yourself out of business. And because the question is, based on your experience, what are the solutions to reduce leftover food?
There's so many. And I think that, the wide range of kind of what's considered leftover, lends itself to so many different solutions to the excess food. And there's this hierarchy kind of submitted or put out there by the EPA that describes kind of the best use of, the excess food. And number one is prevention and, not producing it, right? And that's the number one best way to not use those natural resources and not contribute to, more work that needs to be done to rescue this food. After that, it's to feed people, after which it's feeding animals. And then it goes on to compost. And then lastly, it's landfills, right? And so there's many solutions that do each of those things, right? There's a wide range of for-profit, both established and, new exciting startups that are figuring out ways to prevent that excess food waste directly on source by helping restaurants track their inventory or, measure their excess food, or even, really exciting, cool developments like ways to keep our produce longer. And all of that are ways to reduce that excess food. And then ways to have people be fed by that food include food rescue and food banks and the solutions we have in our space. There are companies that actually do bring some of that excess food to animal farms as well. There's this very famous one in Las Vegas that brings it to pig farms around the area, which is incredible. And of course, there are a lot of composting companies and facilities that are continue to grow across the nation as organic waste bans also grow across the nation as well. So there's just so many solutions. And I think that it's such a massive problem that, there's no silver bullet, and we're excited to kind of work together to be a part of the solution.
Thank you.
How does food waste actually impact carbon emissions?
There are a lot of ways wasted food impacts carbon emissions. The first way is really at the production level. We use so many of our natural resources, and 10% of our, energy budget goes to producing the food that we waste, and we waste 40% of it here in the US. But there's also a lot of impact from it after it's wasted. After we eat it and then we kind of waste it, there are usually natural processes that food goes through. If it's just, an apple core you just throw out in nature or something, it'll go through aerobic digestion and just kind of disappear and go through normal processes. But in landfills, it gets piled on top of each other and goes through a process of anaerobic digestion because it just doesn't have access to oxygen. And that emits methane gases 30 times worse for the environment than carbon dioxide. And people don't really know that if you took the carbon emissions of just food waste alone across the world, it would rank third after USA and China. And so it's a huge, huge impact that we could have if we were to eliminate that carbon emission from wasted food.
You've touched on some of the benefits, but I think in the first podcast we asked what's the benefits to the person who's you're collecting the food from. But I wonder if you could talk to us about, in the broader sense, the benefits to climate, humanity, the whole thing. That and I think we're looking not just at your operation, but if we all fully engaged into dealing with leftover food.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a great question too, just because when you kind of take a step back and look at wasted food and food in general, there's just so many facets to this. And one of them is kind of the moral aspect of it, of, rescuing that food so that someone can eat it. But there's other facets of that as well, where we are slaughtering animals when they don't need to be slaughtered, right? And whatever conditions they are in, that kind of thing, right? There's so many implications of that piece as well. But then if you look at other facets, there's just this huge argument for kind of more of a circular economy and getting to the place where we're much more efficient with our resources and getting to a place where we are kind of minimizing these, negative externalities that come from overproducing, and then wasting. So there's so many implications across the board. And, the more people hear about it, the more people will start to realize how important, people do realize how important food is, but in terms of the, carbon emissions and different aspects, people will start to reduce their wasted food as well.
It's interesting. I'm going to throw you a question that we haven't pre-warned you about. But when we talk about food, and as you said, food's fundamental to us. But there are a lot of campaigners who basically say we should only be eating a plant-based diet. And this, the impacts of that are significant. Now, we've had on podcast, we've had food producers, various different angles on this. But I'm wondering, in the short term, which is going to be more efficient or effective for us, dealing with food waste or going vegetarian?
Oh man, that's a great question. I honestly, I whenever I'm posed with kind of the either or, I'm always tempted to just be like, we should do both. But if we
make it a
good answer, Robert.
Because you could be a vegetarian and waste food. That kind of thing. But if you were really in a position where you had to really choose, I would have to do the math, right? I think that there's specific types of vegetables that produce more and are more impactful, in the negative sense, on the environment. And so I think it really does depend. And it also depends on how much you're wasting already. If you're wasting a ton already, or if you're, wasting only a tiny bit, I think the average American probably, and I'm biased, probably reducing your excess food is the way to go. But again, I'm biased. But yeah, I tend to think that there's just so much carbon emission from production of our meat that it just is a huge. If you're going to eat it, you should eat all of it.
I think that's a very valid comment, and I know it was a cheeky either or question, and that's
it's a great question
because of the sake of it there. But I just a side view on that. I somehow think that we might get more people easily engaged with dealing with food waste than we will getting people to go 100% vegan. And so in terms of it being something we can action and deliver, that said, veganism is, for many people, it's a big moral choice, isn't it? Rather than, anything else. And that's a decision individuals have to make. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So carbon emissions is a big topic, certainly in our field, and I think it's starting to be discussed more and more. I was in New York last week and in real estate conference, and they were talking about embodied carbon and how important. So, that's going to start happening with food, like they're going to start talking about that. But you offer a very important service, as we addressed or discussed in our last podcast. Do you actually track the carbon emissions that are involved in redistributing leftover food? Is that something that you do as well?
Yeah, we do. And it's nothing super sophisticated, and we want to, continue to become more sophisticated in that sense. We use the EPA report to kind of have a conversion from the pounds of food that we rescue to the pounds equivalent of CO2. And we always kind of include that number for our food donor partners in their reports, including the pounds of food, the number of meals they've fed, and people they impacted, but also the carbon emissions that they've reduced. It's tricky because there's both sides of kind of production of the food and then the carbon emission, from the landfills. And when you rescue food, you're not necessarily eliminating the natural resources piece. You're eliminating for sure the landfill piece because it's not going to landfills anymore. And so to parse that specific figure out has been difficult. And I think more research needs to be done to help make that conversion more possible.
So, question, and maybe you've answered this, but the suppliers that you're capturing this, do you report that to them? Or are they asking for that type of information so they can also make that available to their clients?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We work with various food donor partners, and some of them are huge, and they have these, corporate social responsibility reports, and they want to ensure that they have the numbers accurately represented. And so they're asking for it. Luckily, they're able to pull it anytime they want or need on their website portal, on our website, and see by date, by month, whenever they need it, the number of pounds of food they've rescued and all the different metrics.
All right. What is the biggest takeaway for our listeners from this episode?
The biggest takeaway, I'd say, is the fact that there's so many different facets of wasted food, not just the moral and the kind of economic implications, but also the environmental issues, and the fact that we have a huge opportunity 3 times a day to reduce our carbon footprint and to make a difference in our carbon emissions.
Thanks for that. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think what Robert has shared with us in this podcast is that certainly food waste is massive on carbon emissions. I don't think, again, most people would be well aware of that. The work that he and his group are doing is fantastic, but I think it requires, as kind of stated, it requires the whole supply chain, from the farmers to the retailers to restaurants to home residential, to be actively involved and understand that. So I know we've got some work to do. I know agriculture is a big and very important piece. It's essential, quite frankly, as we all know. But I think there's some work for us to do. And I think the work that Robert's doing is really pretty important in actually helping that. So I thought that was, the stats he gave were really pretty interesting.
Agreed. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Well, you guys have taken all the big takeaways. So I've got 2 small takeaways. One of them, I'm old enough to remember when in the UK we had a service that collected food waste and it went to pigs, and it was referred to as pig's wheel. And why did that get discontinued? Because there were problems about what was being put into that food and thereby affecting the output. So, we've got this thing that may be some solutions. For example, I wouldn't suggest it, but I wasn't around at the time, I hasten to add, but in the Second World War, food rationing, people took food more seriously. So I think there's maybe some scope for looking at things we've done in the past and saying, how could we use them today? But the other one that touched me there was you talked about portion sizes. And I was watching a documentary about a restaurant trying to improve its profitability, and they were trying to get the chef to weigh all the ingredients so that they were uniform. And at one point they're saying, well, you need a 70% gross profit margin. Now, if you reduce that, you'll save 3 pence, 6 cents, whatever, on it, and that will improve your profit margin. And you think to yourself, yeah, there's a motivation to reduce food waste, even if you're not thinking about the broader aspects of it.
Absolutely.
I have 2 takeaways from this, both from, again, the consumer portion. So I did spend quite some time working in the greenhouse industry, and I remember something that the greenhouse owners always consistently expressed. Again, they're in the vegetable industry, so I do find it's a little more difficult. There's not as many vegetable juices than fruit juices, right? So imperfect produce is a bigger issue, I would say, on that front. And it was really cool. I remember talking to one of them and them mentioning that one of their marketers is actually coming out with an imperfect produce line. And I do see it in retailers now. So a lot of our major retailers in Canada now have a little slightly discounted which, to be honest, it really doesn't have to be. It's just an appearance version of the produce, and it's called imperfect produce. So maybe there's a little dent here or a dent there. And it really educated me, especially, that appearance of produce, it doesn't equate to quality of produce. I think that's something that we all kind of have a misconception on. And then my second thing, and I've thought a bit about it with our first episode with Robert, but you know, I'm in a pretty developed city. We have great businesses, great communities. However, one thing we do not have is composting. And I find that very interesting because, again, if you're throwing out food, if you don't compost yourself or you don't know anyone that composts, it's going in a landfill. And I definitely think that, you know, outside of this, even if we start reducing our leftover food, there's still scraps of parts that you've cut out and all that. And it just is kind of surprising to me that we have a garbage program, we have a recycling program, and we're still waiting to introduce a composting program. And I know that my city's actually, there's talks of it coming out in the next couple of years, which is exciting, but it definitely is still an issue.
On Lysandra, you're talking about imperfect produce in the supermarket. We've a supermarket here that markets it as wonky veg.
Oh, I love that. That's very UK.
Yeah, well, it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, three, for another great episode.
It's been really
Awesome.
interesting.
This was great.
Yeah, Robert,
you.
thank you.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was fantastic. And we like to talk over each other too, by the way. So that's just
That always happens. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts.